Hello and welcome to our next video. In this lesson, we're going to go over some programming syntax basics. Essentially, we're going to take a look at some of the things we've already been doing so that we're ready to use these skills as we continue to grow and learn more about programming throughout the rest of this course. So go ahead and get the files for Hello World syntax and runner and get those loaded into a project if you haven't already. Now, if you followed the video for setting up a project on Eclipse and NetBeans, you probably already have this ready to go, which is great. Once you have them open, let's go ahead and start looking at Hello World syntax. So just like before, we have our public class Hello World syntax. And again, if we were to do something where we change the name that doesn't match the name of the actual file, the IDE right away is going to tell us, hey, there's a problem here. This needs to match the name of the file, or you need to make a new file that's named the same as what you're using. So you want to make sure that that little piece of syntax is never mistaken. And so what do we mean by syntax? Well, basically we just mean the layout and the structure. And that's the grammar rules for our programming language. And so what happens is if we don't specifically follow some certain rules, we're going to run into problems just like that one. We also saw, as we started to program, one syntactical item, and that is wrapping code blocks in curly braces. And so here what we can see is that within our public class Hello World syntax, the first thing we do is create a left curly brace to open a code block. And at the very bottom, you can kind of see there's a square around it to show the matching curly brace. If I select this one, you might be able to see it a little easier. And if you do that on yours, you might be able to even tell some highlighting if you have it turned on, or it might look a little more darkly highlighted than it does here on my screen. But basically you can see the little square that was put around this curly brace, and that's just showing me that these are the matching curly braces that encompass this entire code block. And so with our syntax, so far what we've seen is we define our class public, and then class keyword, and then Hello World syntax, or whatever the name of our class is. And then we wrap the entire class code with curly braces to signify the code block for that class. We also have our main method. Now what you'll note here is this one's not static, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Our main method contains its own code block which defines the scope of the code within the main method. Now once again, if some of the terms that I'm talking about here today are not quite clear, or you don't quite understand them, that's still a little bit okay. Hopefully at this point some things are starting to make more sense and you're starting to follow along very easily. But when I get to a new word, if it doesn't make sense to you, you can either ask me about it, or we'll define it more later on in most cases, or you can just look it up and say, for example, if you didn't understand what I meant by scope, you could do a quick search and say, what's the scope mean in programming? And essentially what you'd find is the scope is the entire block of code is what would be considered the scope for that method or for that class. So a couple other things about syntax that we won't touch base on again, but I want to present to you today. First of all, Java docs. So a Java doc is a way for us to document our code specifically to generate documentation. When we start growing as programmers, we'll start using the Java APIs, which are available online. And all of those are generated using Java docs from code. And so what happens to create a Java doc, we have a slash followed by 2 stars. Now that signifies that it's going to be a Java doc specifically. And the syntax for a Java doc is simple. You basically need to have a period at the end of the description. And you can have multiple tags. One of them is author, and you might notice that author pops up every time you create a new file. Your IDE might be putting that in there for you. Later there may be things like @param or @throws, and we'll learn about those as we encounter them. And that's just part of the documentation, and those keywords and those syntactical things such as the @author and @throws are going to allow the Java docs to generate specific items that we need to see about our code. Now that helps us as programmers to read through it later and just be able to look at a Java doc and be able to determine what code is doing. But sometimes there are more things going on and we need to tell the next person programming, or even ourselves when we come back to maintain, something that we did and why we did it. So we use comments. Now there are 2 types of comments we can use in our code. The first one is a comment block. And a comment block is a /*, and it's closed with a //. Same as a Java doc's closed with a //. The comment block is closed with a //. The difference is we only have 1 star after the first slash for a comment block. If we did that and added the second star, we'd be creating a Java doc again, and we don't want to do that. The nice thing about a comment block is we can add anything we'd like into the comment block for as many lines as we need, and it will continue to be a comment. And it's very useful for larger sections of documentation, such as what I did here with the keywords, for example. The other type of comment that we can use is a single line comment. And basically, that's 2 slashes. Now, if I take those 2 slashes off, you'll see that it's no longer a comment line. It gives me an error. And I add them back in, it returns to a comment. But if I don't have another slash, the next line is not considered a comment. So it's just a single line. And the other thing about comments is we can start the 2 forward slashes wherever we'd like in the line. So here we can see, as long as this code over here is good code, it would execute. And then we could just add comments at the end of a line if we had something we wanted to tag with comments. So that wraps up commenting. Now what I'd like to do is just talk real quickly about some of the keywords that we've encountered. So we've already seen public. Well, what does public mean? Public basically means that it's available to anyone. And you can think of this like a national park. The public can go in and can visit the national park anytime they'd like, as long as certain rules are followed, right? So that's the same thing. If we make something public, we're going to expose it to the entire system, and as long as they follow a certain set of rules, they'll be able to use that code. And then we have private, which we haven't seen yet. What private will do is lock some code down. Now this is very useful if we want to hide some code within a class from another section of the program, but still need that code available. And so what you can think of this as maybe like the private golf course, where only certain people are allowed to golf on this golf course. And so in order to be able to do that, you have to have the membership or be permitted to do that. Class is a keyword that we've encountered as well, but this simply means an object that we're going to use in Java programming. Now we're going to spend a whole lot of time on classes later on, but the basic thing about classes is we can create new versions of a class. And the next keyword is new. So when we encounter an object, what we'll find is that oftentimes in order to create the object or instantiate the object, we need to make a new version of it. Now this is actually going to allocate a new version of the object into memory. And so what happens is it's essentially saying, give me some space to use this object. Now you can think of this as if you are a recording artist and you have concerts that you need to perform at. Every time you want to schedule an event, you create a new event. And that new event must be scheduled at a venue, and it must take place at a certain time, and all the little rules must be followed for that as well. And so what happens is when I create a new object in my code, it's basically saying, give me a space to use this object, and I'm going to follow the rules, and I'm going to use it for this allotted amount of time. And eventually that will either go away, or I'll clean it up for you, or you can clean it up for me. And so that's just kind of how that works out. So that's an easy way to look at what the new keyword's going to do. But we need that in order to use our objects individually. And finally, static. Now we've seen this in our static void main, but what does it mean? Well, basically it exposes items available to the entire system without having to be made new. Now the reason this works is because there's only one version of it, and it's used throughout the entire system. So what happens is, instead of saying I need a new venue to perform my music at, I say, hey, here's all my files, they're available online in one place. Everybody can just go there and grab those files. Now if I change one of those files online, it changes for everyone. Whereas if I was to change something that I sang at my concert venue, it might not look the same in Chicago or St. Louis. So if I make something new, I have the ability to do a little bit more flexibility in specific instances. But if I have something static, it's the same for everyone, and is only used and referenced from one specific place, such as my iTunes account or something like that. And so the other thing is just a real quick wrap up of some of the code syntax we've already seen. Again, we've seen left and right curly braces, which open and close code blocks. We've seen single quotes, which essentially we use in pairs to start and end string literals. And we've seen left and right brackets very briefly to open and close an array for that string array of arguments. Here we see them right here. And so you can see that eventually this will be a size indicator, and we'll learn about that when we study arrays later in the course. And finally, we've seen semicolons, which we need to have at the end of every directive or statement. And so now what I want to do is just spend a little bit of time showing you the difference between static and new. So if you remember, every main method we've made so far has been static. Now what did that do? Well, that exposed that main method to the entire system without me having to create a new version of the class that was containing it. For example, my runner class. So if we look at the runner code here, what we'll see is that runner contains the static void main. So I don't have to make a new runner in order to execute the main method from runner. But what we saw with hello world syntax is we did not make this static. Now that means that I can create as many hello world syntax objects as I'd like, and then I can call the main method from each one of those individually. So what happens is when I go into my runner main, all I'm going to do is create a version of hello world syntax and give it a variable name HWS. Again, we'll study variables real soon, but you can see how this is going to be used pretty easily here. We assign the variable to a new instance of hello world syntax, and we end that with parentheses just to signify that we're making a new object. And then what we're going to do is just simply make a call to the main method on the hello world syntax object that we're using, and we are going to pass in null. So if you don't understand what null is, that's okay. It means that nothing's going to happen. We're not going to give anything to that method. So this method is taking in an argument, and we'll learn about that as we learn about methods as well. But we're just going to say ignore that because we don't even know how to use it anyway at this point. So let's just make it null and run it. So when I do this, what's going to happen now is it'll actually run runner's static void main, which will create a reference to hello world syntax and run hello world syntax's main. And so basically that shows you the difference between using a static that's available to everyone where you don't have to make a new version of runner to call runner's main, and using the hello world syntax where you did have to make a new version in order to call the hello world syntax main because it's not static. But that wraps up our look at some programming syntax basics that we've covered to this point and that we need to understand going forward. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.